Welcome to Viden, a podcast about research in finance, investing, and economics. I'm Henrik Rasmussen, and I'm your host for today. This episode is produced in collaboration with Deloitte. Deloitte helps Viden get a practical perspective on academic research while also getting inspiration. This explorative collaboration bridges the gap between academics and practitioners, and we really appreciate Deloitte's support of expanding academic knowledge. Today we're going to talk about mergers and acquisitions. How do you successfully acquire and integrate another company, and why do so many fail when trying to do so? To answer these questions, we've brought a robust lineup of both practical experience and academic research with our two guests. In this episode, I have Caspar Rose with me, who is an associate professor from Copenhagen Business School and a lawyer in Rose Advocater, which consults about M&A. Thank you for coming, Caspar.
Thank you so much.
I also am joined by Mikkel Boe, who is a partner at Deloitte. Thank you for coming too, Mikkel.
Thank you.
So just to start off, Caspar, what do you spend your time on at Copenhagen Business School?
Currently at the moment I'm actually finishing up a book in Danish that is entitled Shareholder Rights, which actually deals with a lot of these issues that also are relevant when we talk about M&As. And apart from that, I'm also finishing up an application for a major research project that actually tried to investigate how stock markets respond when major listed companies, they announce whether to stay or leave in Russia. So there are a lot of practical implications and empirical stuff, hopefully. So I hope that'll be a success, but that's hard work and also a lot of data digging we need to analyze. But I'm in the process, but I'm quite confident.
Okay. Russian data, that must be hard to...
Yeah, it's not only Russian data, it's about foreign companies that have subsidiaries in Russia, and that's really an intriguing issue because, I mean, they are more or less like what we call in Danish plague or cholera, because you have to take a decision either to stay there or simply to leave. But it's a very difficult decision. There are also financial and also legal implications, but that's another story.
Yeah. Okay, and Mikkel, what kind of experience do you have within this field of mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, I work with, as a partner in the Deloitte consulting M&A practice, I work with the strategic and operational elements of the M&A journey. So helping our clients all the way from M&A strategy through to transaction and due diligence, and also realizing the value of the transaction in the post-merger integration or carve-out phase of a transaction. So I've had the pleasure of working with some of the largest transactions in Denmark, and I really enjoy helping realizing these transformational moves for our clients. Not only about doing the right transaction, but also about the right value realization afterwards.
Mm-hmm. The data on how mergers and acquisitions turn out for the buyer has looked pretty dark for a long time. When a buyer announces an acquisition, the shareholders often react by sending the stock price down, and the initial stock price reaction has actually been documented to be a good predictor of how the acquisition ends up working out. Why are there so many M&A deals that fail to deliver value, Caspar?
There are mainly two reasons for that. First of all, it's typical that the buyer simply pays too much, that the buying company or acquiring company simply overpays. That could be that the buying company is simply paying a too high premium compared to the current market value of the target company. We know from prior studies that the premium is in Scandinavia about 30%. It's a bit higher in the US. But it's really difficult to realize value because you have to extract synergies above the premium you're actually paying. So the one major reason for that a lot of M&As, they simply fail is due to overpaying for the target shareholders. It's always good to be target shareholder. The other reason is that it's very difficult to integrate, and very often it's simply due to the failure of integrating the target company. And that is, in my view, a highly overlooked issue, because very often it turns out, that's at least my own experience, that top management in the acquiring company has a lot of focus on the numbers and all the due diligence, and that's fine. But when the company is acquired, all the boring stuff, all the stuff with humans, how they integrate it, how we create a new culture, all these very important issues are very often neglected. So these are the two main reasons why a lot of M&As, they simply don't deliver value.
Yeah. And Mikkel, what do you think, what do you experience in practice are some of the most common pitfalls in M&A deals?
Yeah, and I very much agree with Caspar. I mean, I think the mindset is also about considering capital as a luxury that you cannot just spend. And I sometimes compare large M&A transactions to what would the process be if a company instead were acquiring a new ERP system to use 200 million kroner on a new ERP system. That typically in most big organizations would take at least a year of a decision process and evaluations and back and forth. And sometimes companies, when about to spend 1 billion on an M&A transaction, they rush through in 6 weeks in a competition to get there first and win the deal. And I think that mindset about winning the deal, not looking whether it might be a good idea to win at a given price or not, is sometimes how processes are caught up. And also it's about sometimes underestimating the complexity on the prerequisites that lies in actually realizing the value case, just like Caspar says. So when you need to earn back the capital you spend on an acquisition, you put the money up front. And what you need to earn back and what you need to prove to investors and owners that you can earn back is the premium you pay, of course. And it's also the inherent current growth projection value of the company you buy. Because without your acquisition, they were also going to grow and increase in value probably over the coming years. So having a robust plan to actually show how do we actually then realize that extra benefit through the transaction is key. And sometimes we see major transactions in Denmark where stock prices fall significantly at announcement. And most often it's due to not having that very clear plan of synergy realization.
Yeah. Interesting, you mentioned this about rushing through with deals because it touches a bit upon a subject that I remember from CBS on what's it called, loss aversion, or like sunk costs. Like if you have already invested a lot of time and energy researching a deal, deciding not to go through with the deal, it's like a loss in the brain of the manager or the CEO. We've spent all this time researching this company. Why should we not just pull the trigger and buy the deal, even though it seems very expensive? Is that also a factor?
Yeah, exactly. That psychology works a lot. And we also often see in transactions that there typically is a business owner owning the line of business where this transaction fits in, who really wants typically to have the transaction done, and a very robust process, but also governance that ensures that you do this sort of more thoughtfully and loyal to your buying criteria and the value case that you have is key. So it's all about being basically a prepared acquirer. So when you look at an investment, when you look to spend the luxury capital of buying another company, that you compare that always to the second best alternative. So what is the second best investment you could make with that money? What's the payback of that? And how is it that this investment pays back more to the value of your company?
Yeah,
that's a very good point. And one thing I'm always also teaching when I do board courses is, and because we have to avoid the danger that we are steering only on a target company, always look what is the best alternative. And very often our brain is not suited for that, because when the CEO, very often he's running the game, he's actually been in love with this target company. And the problem is that we might spend a lot of resources, due diligence, in doing all the calculations and have an integration plan, which is also extremely important. But very often it turns out that there are some conditions that simply make the deal unfavorable. But then it's very hard for the CEO, because he has invested so much social capital in a deal, to say, okay, guys and ladies, we simply have to abandon the deal. Because as you also said, we have spent a lot of money on this deal. But from an economic perspective, all this money, they are simply defined as sunk cost. They don't care. But have the gut and courage to simply walk away. That's also very important. And I think it's very important for the board of directors to give the CEO room for leaving the deal, simply if some of the conditions, or they find something in the due diligence report which is simply non-favorable. So have the gut to walk away from a deal, because always to save money. That's also one other way to look at it, how to earn money, that to save money.
Yeah. And from the being a proactive and prepared acquirer, I think the next step that is really important to succeed is that you then don't get rushed through a process, but spend the necessary focus and time on pressure testing these assumptions of the value case in sufficient due diligence. And most companies do financial and tax due diligence. That's a must. Sometimes overlooking sort of the commercial due diligence that tests the growth trajectory of the value case, and the operational due diligence that actually tests the cost base of running the business, the prerequisites for realizing the synergies. So what does it actually take to integrate and run the business after acquisition? So it's really important to spend that adequate amount of time of pressure testing the value case once you have defined it.
Yeah. And Caspar, you also mentioned one of the biggest factors for failure was to overpay for a company when you want to buy it. And what I had to wrap my head around the first time I learned about mergers and acquisitions was that to actually buy a company, you have to pay a premium. You have to pay more than what it's worth currently on the stock exchange, because if not, why would they sell the company to you? There's no benefit.
That's correct. And you have to pay some additional because the current market price simply reflects the current ownership structure. And if you are dealing with a majority owner that seeks full control or an acquirer, then this acquirer needs to pay up a premium to have complete control of the company. So it's really difficult to add some additional value, but that's how the game is, and that's why some of these CEOs and their team simply need to have some input from outside consultants. Because another thing we should always remember is that the CEO, and he cannot just turn to his internal team, because they will simply say whatever he wants to hear. So you have to ask some external persons to assist you, and also be able to ask all the critical questions, because it's very important. And also my experience, that's from a board perspective, that you have to have a relatively detailed integration plan with some milestones. And if these integration synergies are not realized within, let's say, maximum 2 years, they're simply defined as more or less pure air. So it's quite important actually to have clear goals from the start. Of course, you may not realize all the milestones from the start, but it's very important to have some kind of idea. What is the distribution between cost synergies and sales synergies, and whatever it is from the start, and then to keep your focus really on how to implementing the synergies. That's very important.
Yeah. Now you mentioned the word synergies because actually, if you pay a premium for a company, the only way to make it worth it, to make it a good deal, or at least one of the main ways, is to make that company worth more than it was when you bought it by realizing this thing called synergies. That maybe your company can provide something to the company you buy that will increase the value of it. Maybe a better IT system, or what do you think? What are some of the most common synergies, and what's the definition?
You could say that. I mean, the definition is straightforward. I mean, we want to create some additional value, but the point is that normally we distinguish between what we call sales synergies, typically more sales, additional sales, cross-selling, whatever it is, and then cost synergies. If you want to realize what we call the low-hanging fruit, you will try to realize the cost synergies. That could be simply to merge common departments, whatever. If you have 2 legal departments, if you have 2 HR, whatever, to merge them into a single one, whatever, to optimize production facility and all these issues. They are the cost synergies, and they are in the short run more easy to realize. And very often it's my impression that especially the sales synergies, they are overestimated from start. Then you have to really think it through, because sometimes there might be some legal issues that you cannot really realize the sales synergies. There could be some competition issues, right? So a lot of things that you have to think in advance before you actually sign the deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned cross-selling, for example, and just to give an example of that, where I work, which is now Nordea Pension, used to be Topdanmark Liv, the pension arm of Topdanmark, and we were acquired by Nordea. So an example of a cross-selling synergy there could be that Nordea is now able to sell banking products to the pension customers, of Top MacLeod, and they are able to sell pension products to the bank customers, right?
Yeah, but you have to be aware about these issues. Just to give an example, I'm trying to do it in an anonymous way. It could be, for instance, take the example that you're dealing with a bank that wants to acquire an insurance company. It could make sense that once you, for instance, enter a bank and you're actually buying a house, it could be a good idea to go through all your insurance policies. But the problem is that there are some legal limitations on how a bank advisor can actually advise within the issue of insurance. And they cannot, for instance, be located in the same physical room. There are some rules that actually try to have what we call Chinese walls. So what actually on paper looks as a fine idea, there might be some legal issues that you have to figure out. So this is simply not possible in reality.
Yeah, and if I can add, synergies are extremely important because without them you don't have a case, as you say, in terms of earning back the premium. We typically operate with 3 categories of synergies. So the revenue synergies we're talking about, the cost synergies, but also then the resilience or risk mitigation synergies. Okay. I mean, sometimes buying a company that outbalances the fluctuations of your business, that gives you a contra-cyclical revenue compared to your existing business units, or giving you another type of sort of risk profile compared to what you have, is also a category of synergies. Just to make the list complete. Yeah. But the difficult thing about synergies is not to get scared away by the fact that it's difficult, because you need to take that synergy case that at an acquisition time is most often based on assumptions. If we get our salespeople to collaborate in Asia, we can grow revenue by X%. But the actual sort of operational projects that will make that possible is much more unclear at the time of signing typically. So it's about taking that synergy plan and making it very, very concrete and operational. So what exactly should we do tomorrow morning in order to ensure this synergy to be realized? Because they don't come by themselves. And in my experience as well, Caspar, the most difficult ones are the revenue synergies. Getting salespeople actually to have comfort in selling at different companies' products that they may use to compete with, and bringing that to their trusted clients can take many years to do that transformation if you do not do it very focusedly. Yeah. So those are the most difficult.
Yeah, but actually interesting you mentioned this thing about risk synergies, which my mind kind of goes to Maersk, who at one point had an oil business as well as having their freight ships.
Yeah, a good example, yeah.
Yeah, their freight ships use a lot of fuel, which comes from the oil, and Maersk produced oil themselves. Exactly. So would that be an example?
Yeah, a very good example. And other examples, of course, is around the cyclical demand curves that you would see in different sectors and segments, right? Utilizing your assets, perhaps, more efficiently, because you can deploy them towards 2 different business models if you have a diversification strategy. Yeah. So there are many examples, but it's also a category to look into for the business case of acquisition.
Okay. If there is a diversification synergy, is it also possible that the 2 businesses that diversify each other actually have nothing to do with each other? Like if you make cars and bikes to diversify whether clients wants to buy cars or bikes in the future, like to reduce the risk of customers only wanting to buy bicycles in the future, for example. But then there are not really any production synergies. Or what?
May I just add on here? This is really an interesting question, because, I mean, I fully understand that it makes sense, let's say, to have some negatively correlated activities. That you mentioned a good example of Maersk. But from a perspective of the shareholders, it's much easier and cheaper to diversify themselves. That's also why we see that there's what we call a conglomerate discount. So that there's actually a discount if you buy into a conglomerate compared to splitting up the company that is equivalent to 15% more or less. Okay. So it's actually cheaper for the shareholders themselves to diversify, to create their own what we call efficient portfolios. But from a managerial perspective, it makes sense to diversify their risk. That's something that we sometimes have to keep in mind. That might be a difference. But also another point I want to emphasize is very often it's a good idea to have some, as you also mentioned, some clear goals and milestones in the integration plan. And very often you could add also some KPIs for the CEO and his or her team. Because if they are not rewarded in a sense, depending on the acquisition, that there's a risk that they will not spend additional and sufficient of time to implement all the synergies. Also when we are talking about a rainy day. So trying to keep up a few simple KPIs associated with this deal is also a good thing you could contemplate, because you need to create this, you could say this interaction or this you could say alignment of interest between the CEO and his or her team and also the acquisition. They have to make as a full attention to it. Otherwise it will be a half work and that will not work.
Yeah, that was actually a question I was thinking about too, like how important is it to align incentives in these M&A deals, and you mentioned adjusting performance-based pay. Yeah. Are there also other tools to adjust incentives, or?
Yeah, one of the things that we also need to highlight, and that's maybe one of the difficult parts, it is to identify who are actually the key employees in the acquiring company, in the target company, sorry. And because that's very important, because there are no such thing as let's say I'm defined as a key employee, let's say in target, that such a title does not exist. So we have to identify who are actually the key employees, and we need to make sure that they actually stay in the company for a longer period and they're actually participating in this knowledge transformation, because otherwise there's a risk that we are buying a company which is more or less an empty shelf. So you have to figure out how to also incentivize them. It could be the use of a stay-on bonus, which is, of course, you cannot do it for listed companies, but all other companies you can actually contemplating using a stay-on bonus for key employees in the target company.
Yeah, and I think now we're touching on one of the most difficult or delicate elements of an M&A transaction, that the fact that both for the acquirer but also for the target, this is a major transformation, right? It changes, potentially at least, every element of the business, from where you're located to the organization to what you do every day, to the access card to enter the building, the systems you use. Everything basically is potentially changed in an acquisition, depending on the degree of integration, of course. And my experience is that I sometimes see transactions and CEOs being very enthusiastic around the great support from employees. They hold a town hall, 200 people gathered, they tell the story, and everybody applaud and ask positively interested questions, right? But that's not basically, in my mind, the same as the fact that all the employees are behind the deal and the consequences. What I find in my work is that what's really worrying the employees is the degree of uncertainty, and its degree of uncertainty on their own personal agendas. So where will I work? Will I need to move to Ballerup or whatever and commute? And if I do that, can I pick up my daughter every Tuesday as I usually should? Who will be my boss? What about my colleagues? Will I like the new culture of the company that we are joining forces with? And all of those very near questions are the ones that are actually worrying. I was part of a transaction recently last year where completely independent of the transaction, there were some of these small phone booths being put out in the atrium of the acquirer, which is very common in business today, that they are put up to ensure small meetings and telephone calls. And suddenly a rumor arose that these were for all the layoff talks. So after day one, people would stand in a line basically towards these small glass cages to get laid off one by one. Oh, no. And it, of course, completely ridiculous, completely untrue, and not at all founded in anything. Yeah. There were no big layoffs planned, for instance. But that's just a sign of how that uncertainty can spear a lot of worry, a lot of defocus, a lot of good people searching for other jobs because they do not get these questions answered early up front and with some clear direction.
Just to add on, I completely agree. But I think that the key word here is really communication. Mm-hmm. And that's communication needs to be aligned between the target and acquiring top management. So we need to have communication which is not only aligned but is also fast, efficient, and clear, so that it doesn't create uncertainty, because the purpose of the communication is to minimize uncertainty. Of course, there might be some limitation depending on we are dealing with listed companies, and you got all the issues with insider and disclosure and all these issues. But from a managerial perspective, it's very important you have a clear plan towards communication, internal communication. Of course, also external, but especially because there will always be a risk that the most bright and best people in a target company, they will simply just leave. Because then I have an excuse to say, let's try to find another job, because there's a risk I'll get a new idiot as a new boss, right? So we really have to, first of all, identify, who are the key employees in the target company. That's a very challenging task, because there's no such thing as I'm the key personnel. There's not such title. But you have to try the exercise anyway. And secondly, you have to be very coherent and consistent in your communication, and don't hesitate. And also to be very honest in your communication. If you want to fire X number of people or outsource, whatever it is, make it clear from the start. Don't try to sneak it in. Be honest from the start. That's the best strategy, even if it hurts and it creates a lot of noise in the organization. That's also something that you have to acknowledge and deal with. But communication here is the key word.
Yeah. And the other key word perhaps connected to that is of course this all comes from a very detailed and robust integration plan that should already be ready at signings, because if without a plan you cannot communicate anything, right? But on the basis of that, the other defining moment that I typically talk to CEOs about is appointing the new organization or leadership appointments. How do you do that? How fast do you do that? Typically, an acquiring CEO does not know the leadership team detailed from the target, and some companies tend to pull that out too long. In my experience, extending that uncertainty for month and month, because we need to get to know each other. We need a mutual discovery phase of finding out who's right for which job. And it might be brutal to say, but in my experience, it's much better to have it 90% right fast, rather than spending 3 or 4 months exploring the 10% of uncertainty you might have. Yeah. So setting also the leadership team early, making those people responsible for driving the definition of next level leaders in the combined organizations, etc., is really key, because not doing it creates that defocus and uncertainty that we talked about.
Yeah, I just wanted to zoom in a little bit on communication you mentioned as an important factor. Because I guess it's not only employees being uncertain about what's going to happen when the company is bought, but also shareholders, for example, and managers. Is it communication to all of these stakeholders that are important, and what kind of communication?
But we have to distinguish between, of course, there are some differences also depending whether we are dealing with listed companies, right? Because they have to obey to certain stock market rules. But it's very important that we have a clear communication plan towards the internal stakeholders. And also in some of the people, the acquiring companies, they also may have some employees with fear from the job, because if, let's say, the merger is driven by cost synergies, there's a risk that they will simply be laid off. So very clear communication, that's very important. Of course, also to the external stakeholders, including shareholders. But I think they are not mutually exclusive, but they have to be communicated in a different way. Because of course employees, they have a lot of knowledge about the company, but they care about their personal social future. Shareholders, they care about whether we are actually on the right track with respect to realizing all the synergies. So there's a completely different kind of communication, but we have to be aware of both types. That's very important. And also another point which I would like to emphasize is that we should always remember that when you're in charge of a new company, when you have acquired a company, you have a high degree of liberty to take all the difficult decisions. I always say you have 100 days to take all the unpleasant necessary decisions. Take them right away. Don't wait to exercise them. So you have this, like when you start in a new job position, you sometimes make some errors, but that's fair enough. You have to learn in a very fast way. So take the unnecessary decision in a clear, consistent manner from the start, and not wait to postpone them. That's the worst thing you can do. Because then there's a risk that all the bright and good people, they will simply leave the company.
What kind of communication do you give to the shareholders when you make this kind of acquiring?
I mean, they have to be trusted that we actually on the right track with respect to realizing all the synergies, and they need, of course, to be have some updated information. And if sometimes uncertainty simply occurs and we are not on the right plan, we have to come up with some kind of explanation how to realize it anyway. And if we are delayed and if there are some external issues, very often it's actually due to external things you cannot control. It could be all sorts of, let's say, political risk, whatever. You are simply not able to foresee. The thing is that you have to communicate with the shareholders and convince them that you are able to deal with also external uncertainties in a consistent and efficient manner. That's very difficult. So you really have to convince that you are not overpaying, but you are on the right track, and you actually have a plan and you have a communication strategy. And if something happens from, let's say, from the outside, then you actually have an organization that is able to take care of this in the best way. But always to be honest, also to say that it's not simply just a straightforward exercise. There'll always be issues, but you have to have the organization, the skills, and the will to implement it. So it's very really about, I will say the single word here is simply trust. Do shareholders trust that the CEO and his or her team, they have the necessary qualification, they have the good advisors, and they have also a willing to spend the necessary time to implement all the synergies, because that's very often the hard and boring stuff afterwards when you have acquired a company.
Mikkel, do you experience in practice when the company has acquired another company and announced that, but then later communicates their plans of integration, for example, to the market? If the market doesn't like it, it sends down the stock price. I can imagine in practice, managers, the CEO, the board can get quite nervous. So is there a pressure to okay, let's go out and change the statement, or let's maybe announce another plan to satisfy the shareholders, or because it can be quite kind of a game with the communication, right?
Yeah, it can, and I agree very much. Sorry, Caspar, to what you were saying about it's about trust, right? And it's right from announcement day to signal that trust, that this is based on a thorough plan. We can actually document how we want to realize the value, and that trust also gives that dilemma that you're asking about around. So, do we communicate externally to our investors that we have everything in control and we will realize synergies more than enough, which is a very hard target setting, or do we think about all our employees and how would they receive a message around synergies? To employees, synergies means layoffs, right? Or reductions in some way to a large extent. And that's typically also the dilemma that management and the CEO is in. And I think you need to do both. I think you need to be honest, you need to be bold, you need to communicate to your owners that they can trust you with the plan of realizing the value that was set out, both in terms of capabilities, thoroughness of plan, diligence of the assumptions. So what should hold true for this plan to succeed? We've got those things covered. That should be mentioned already at announcement day. But then you also need to be honest and manage the expectation of the employee base. But if you try to stand in the middle of that, you will lose on both communication fronts. Yeah.
Don't be a flag in the wind.
Yeah.
No, also I completely agree, but also I'm just getting inspired. Very often when we're dealing with a company, even if it's a listed company, there might actually be one or two or three, even majority shareholders. And it's very often, at least in my experience, to talk with them before you actually enter the deal or sign the deal, because to have their acceptance and also present them. Of course, if you are dealing with a listed company, that's confidential information, but then they have to sign an NDA. But it's very important to get their opinion on board, and also if they are committed afterwards to raise some additional equity. It could have, they could, be part of the funding round in order to finance the deal. But apart from that, it's also about credibility. So if you're able to send out the stock announcement where you actually also explain that we have the two largest investors, they're actually backing up the plan and then they are following more closely than all the smaller shareholders, that will create a higher degree of trust.
Also, Mikkel, do you think are there other common challenges that companies face when trying to realize these synergies in M&A deals, or have we covered most bases?
No, I think we do. I mean, some things that we haven't covered so much is sort of orchestrating what happens after signing. And what I typically say is that an integration, or the point that you take over a company after signing or carving a big part of your company out, is basically the same. That's a process of a short amount of time and maybe 1,000 important decisions. And basically the normal governance, the business as usual governance of your company is not geared towards that process where you need to decide, okay, org structure, locations, ways of working, which client contracts or customer contracts do we handle in which way, etc., etc., etc. So there are 1,000 very important decisions to be made in a very short time. And forming an integration program with that governance that is tailored to do that, with an integration management office that can coordinate both what happens in the planning of the integration in the work streams, but also those decision-making processes in the organization is key. So thinking about the 3 months and 1,000 important decisions, that's very difficult to do just alongside business as usual. If you are a business unit VP that also runs a day-to-day business line, that's typically not the governance that would cater for what is needed in an integration. So being very mindful of focusing an integration program and prioritizing that this is something you need to invest in order to achieve the benefits.
Okay. And how can companies avoid overestimating synergies? Because that's something we talked about in the beginning is a big factor for deals that fail if you don't realize the synergies. If you paid so much because you thought there was a lot of synergies, but maybe there wasn't.
The first point is be careful about benchmarks. I see a lot of people traveling around with benchmarks saying, we can improve this and do that. And that's always really difficult because comparability between your situation and that average benchmark of something from the US is typically very low. Okay. So I would go another way. I would proof test the assumptions as much as I can in a due diligence phase and ask the question, what should be true for this to happen? So for us to increase sales in Asia by 8%, what should be true? And then look at the realism of that and the prerequisites for that. Estimate the cost to achieve, because nothing is free, not even synergies. It comes with an investment to achieve it. So you get more thorough and more into the synergy case. And then we sometimes work with confidence intervals, saying, okay, we might have a maximum synergy of 100 here, but what risk factors should we apply to that synergy in order to make it realistically realizable? That could also be the difference between your internal stretch target synergy plan and your externally communicated synergy plan that you need to prove at every investor call from then on that you are on the right track to realize, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
What are the benchmarks that you mentioned can be dangerous to use?
Yeah, cost-saving benchmarks or synergy benchmarks or revenue benchmarks. It's always a difficult route to get, and sometimes it's what you tend to do if you have less information, right? But I think working through the assumptions and the prerequisites for a given value sort of line or lever one by one is a better approach than to depend on some average benchmark in some area.
Yeah. Okay. Just to tip in, at least that's my experience, that we should try to avoid what I call the US approach, because the US is a big country, as we all know, and it makes sense for them to have some kind of benchmark because the market and the country is so big. But in a small country like Denmark, there's a risk that will tip into some pitfalls of comparing apples and pears. I mean, we could also, that's a classical case when we talk about relative valuation multiples. Whatever, I mean, compare our sales current with what we want to achieve, compare with the peers. Who are the peers? Nobody knows, to be honest. And it really depends how to measure the peers, how to define the industry, and all these issues. They are very difficult in a small country like Denmark. But in the US, it's really more or less cut and paste. It doesn't matter. It's so easy. But in Denmark, it's really difficult. And so we should avoid trying to tip into this trap that we're just trying to, let's say we have define some peers, and then we have some measure where we want to increase compared to our peers. That's the easy story on paper, but very often it doesn't hold. But I think it's very important also to use scenario analysis, to see and try to model different scenarios, best, good, and worst case. Try to do it relatively simple. Don't make 100 and spreadsheets. But in relatively simple, what are the key challenges that can actually destroy the business case? What are the risks? Because always, I mean, I've seen in several times, again, from a board perspective, that you have a CEO and he and her team presents all the good stuff, and they are actually convincing the board that we should go ahead for this merger, and they are able to increase, let's say, sales synergies above peers doing X, Y, Z. But what are the risks? So that you have to turn on the paper and to see what are the key risks that could actually make it non-realizable. So that's very important to ask, and of course, it does not mean that we should stop the deal if there are some risk, but we have to address the risk. We have to have some kind of how to deal with them. How can we mitigate, if it's possible to mitigate, and what are the risks that we simply want just to accept? They are part of doing the business. But the point is also that the synergy should not only keep in a separate analysis, but you also have to include what are the associated risks. That's very important.
Mm-hmm. Something we haven't touched much upon is culture. And it's often mentioned in this area that cultural differences between the merging companies can be a factor. How much do you, Mikkel, experience that can impact the success of an M&A deal?
Yes, it is maybe one of the elements that impacts the success the most. And I think the challenge is that it becomes a topic that everybody talks about, but nobody does anything about. So I think 2 points in my experience is that it is really important. And we all know the merged companies where 10 years after, there's still a them and us culture or distinction between how we do things, proving that the culture was never really integrated. So I think 2 points that are really important to me is that, yes, it matters very much in terms of realizing the benefits of an integration in general. And secondly, it's not something that happens while you look away. Culture is something you can influence, something you can build, something you can manage. Because what is culture? Culture is the effect of our management systems, our ways of working, our leadership style, our organizational flatness, the way we approach our employees in the business. And that's something you can manage, that's something you can influence, that's something you can set a plan for. So don't think of this as something very unconcrete that just happens while you look away. It's actually something that you should manage as part of your integration plan very proactively. And also realizing that there's not one culture in a company. There's typical several cultures in different parts of the organization. An engineering heavy production unit could have one culture while the HR team has another one in the same company. So being mindful that this is something you also need to diligence, you also need to gap analyze, and you also need to plan a way to close those gaps in a transaction.
Okay, so what you're saying is actually that it's not only important, like the only way to succeed is not to find a company that has the same culture as yours. It's also possible to have differences in culture and work at changing those. Yeah. Actively.
Actually, I think the hypothesis of finding a company that has exactly the same culture, I think you should just disregard as a strategy. That never happens. What we often hear is that here we have two very comparable companies and they're almost the same. And once you start working with them, there are huge differences on the culture because there always is. So I think being mindful of actually diagnosing those cultures or defining those cultural differences and working to towards a common culture is something to take literal and serious.
Okay. Because it seems to me very difficult to change people and the way they think, but you actually think there's a lot of examples where two companies work on the culture together and they change and in the end they end up as having just one culture in common.
Yeah, or at least a deliberate culture. Maybe it's a different one that each of the two companies had. But what values, what should we drive towards? Should we be a controlled environment where everybody asks permissions to do things? Or are we a free and innovative environment that trusts the employees with responsibility? All of those things are an effect of our management style, our processes, our communication, etc. So all of those things could also be influenced deliberately.
Yeah. Do you think, like, if we just take two companies, one that has a very steep organization culture, where the leaders have everything to say and employees don't have so much independence, and then on the other hand you have a very flat organization where everyone has a say, when you put those two companies together, is there a tendency to go towards flatness or steepness, or does it just not work together, or how? Any examples there?
I would think the tendency is more towards the fact that the acquirer's culture, if you do not proactively consider culture as a transformation, then often the acquirer will assume that their culture is the continuing culture, and maybe overlook the performance issues and motivation issues and retention issues that you will get by not considering the gap and what you need to do to close the gap.
Mm. Finally, I would like to ask the both of you, what kind of advice would you give to future potential acquirers? Caspar, maybe you
let's
first.
try to sum up. I mean, I mentioned in the start briefly that there are two issues that why that a lot of M&As, they simply don't gain additional value. That's simply due to overpaying and lack of integration. And I think overpayment, that's something you can do something about relatively easy, but the challenge and most difficult part, as also we heard here, is really how to deal with integration, especially if you're a Danish company buying up foreign companies. We don't need to go far. Just buying a German or Swedish company, we'll see that the company is completely different. And sometimes also acknowledge that from an operational perspective, we may integrate synergies, but it may actually turn out that be a good idea just to leave the culture as it is in the acquiring company as a standalone. Because this, I mean, we should just acknowledge that there's not certain thing that you can just adapt a new culture as you adapt a new jacket or whatever it is. It's a very long-term project. So my point is that to think about and to have a coherent plan about integration is probably the most important part of it in a word, we are focusing on creating value. So don't estimate a culture. It cannot be left for the HR. That's a short answer on a very difficult question.
Yeah, okay. And Mikkel, final advice?
Yeah, again, maybe summing up a little bit, but I think there are three things, right? First is be thoughtful and strategic about the acquisition. So don't get rushed into the process. Don't skip the due diligence because a seller is requiring you to put a bid in 3 weeks' time. So treat it as a luxury capital and have the adequate process for you to make sure you're applying that capital right. And to be clear on the value case and the prerequisites for realizing that value case, and especially the latter part, because that's, in my experience, where it goes wrong typically, that you do not have the clear action plan behind every synergy line. So you do not know what it would take for you to actually achieve the value case. Thirdly, don't underestimate the integration. Back to my point around the 1,000 decisions, and a lot of things need to be changed or at least considered. How do we do this in a new setting? Designing a new combined operating model and implementing that is not to be done sort of with a 10% allocation next to your day job. It is a focused insight that require prioritization. And maybe an appendix to my 3 recommendations is a colleague of mine, Mark Serova, have written a book, The Synergy Solution by Harvard Business Review. And that's actually, in my mind, one of the best M&A books written over the past decade. So that's also a recommendation, as you're asking for recommendations.
Yeah, we'll definitely give that a read. Okay, but then I'll just say thank you to the both of you for your time. It was a pleasure talking with you, Caspar.
Thank you for coming. Yeah.
And thank you too, Mikkel, for coming.
Thank you for the time.
Tak for, at du lyttede med til Rig på Viden. Jeg håber, at du lærte noget, og hvis du nu synes godt af vores podcast, så kan du støtte os ved at følge den på Spotify eller skrive en anbefaling på iTunes. Inde på LinkedIn, der kan du følge André Thormand, Benjamin Somofen eller Henrik Foged Rasmussen. På genhør.